And naturally, China views AUKUS with its usual vitriol dislike and a blatant threat of retaliation. There are no other people than our three distinguished guests today to provide the most authoritative answers to some questions we have. So I'll start by asking each of our distinguished guest panelists a question. And after that, John and Brian will pose their own questions. So my first question is for Mr. Morrison. What motivated Australia to enter this deal? Why does Australia need nuclear submarines?
Well, thanks, Miles, and g'day to Boris and to Mike. It's great to be joining you from late night over here in Australia. I'll get right to it. At the end of the day, AUKUS was a product of the events and the scenario that we faced at that time. Australia was looking to put itself in a position to have 12 diesel-powered conventional submarines. But what was very clear is that the rapid militarisation of China meant that the usefulness of diesel-powered submarines in that theatre over the next 20 to 30 years and beyond meant they'd be largely obsolete before they even got wet. And with some delays we were experiencing with that project, we considered that we needed a plan B, but we needed a plan B that was better than plan A. And that meant we needed to do everything we can to realise the opportunity for nuclear-powered submarines. Conventionally armed, there's never been any suggestion that Australia wanted nuclear-armed submarines, only ever conventionally armed. But the nuclear-powered submarines would enable us to go further, be under for longer, to operate undetected in some of the most contested maritime domains anywhere in the world, if not the most contested. To do this needed a partnership, and the partnership required, obviously, the United States as the custodians of the technology. But there is a deep and lasting relationship between Australia and the United Kingdom, and particularly between our navies. And with the UK being the only other country with which the United States has trusted another nation with that technology, they were the obvious partner to work together with to ensure that together, Australia, the United States and the UK could have a greater capability here in the Indo-Pacific. This was not about displacing the capability of the United Kingdom or the United States and their nuclear-powered submarine capabilities. It was about adding to our collective capabilities. It brought the UK further into the Indo-Pacific, which was a stated objective of Boris and his government. And so there was a clear alignment of our objectives. And of course, our alliance with the United States and the whole development of that strategic environment, we understood that together with the United States, and particularly Secretary Pompeo and Secretary Esper, and of course Vice President Pence and President Trump over the course of that administration, and that was carried through under the Biden administration. But it isn't just about nuclear-powered submarines. It's about having the most advanced defence technology of any three partners working together of anyone in the world. That is what establishes a credible deterrent and realises Australia's defence strategy, which we outlined, which was to keep adversaries further away for longer. And there is nothing more effective than nuclear-powered submarines to enable us to do that in partnership with our key partners, being, of course, the United States, principally within the region, but, of course, the United Kingdom playing a more significant role in the region. It enabled Australia to add value to these partnerships and relationships. So it made sense strategically, it made sense in terms of how we built up our capability. We were able to convince the US system in particular that we were able to do this, and that understanding was built up significantly under the Trump administration, and then realised in the affirmation that we got from the Biden administration. So this is a partnership that goes well beyond both sides of politics in all of our countries. It will span generations, and that means it requires a consistent commitment from all leaders over a long period of time. But it was a great privilege to commence it, particularly with Boris, and frankly, it would not have got over the line were it not for the strong commitment we had from Prime Minister Johnson at that time. We completely fused on, I think, Boris on the idea from the outset, and it put us in a very strong position to take that to the United States, and where it was received very, very well, and the rest is history.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison. And my next question is for Mr. Pompeo. Sir, why is this agreement important for the U.S. global strategy in general and for a free and an open Indo-Pacific in particular? What was the previous and the current administration's reaction to this deal, either during this negotiation stage and in its final formation?
Well, Miles, good evening and good morning to those who are on U.S. time. Prime Minister Johnson, Prime Minister Morris, it's great to be back with you all again. And I want to start by giving full credit to the Biden administration for bringing this to conclusion and continuing to build on it even today as we sit here. As Prime Minister Morrison said, this is not remotely partisan inside the United States. This is deeply about U.S. national security interests. It's not about Democrats or Republicans. It's about finding the place in the world for those of us who believe in basic human dignity, property rights, all the things that each of our three countries, the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States have stood for decades and decades. Brilliant work by Prime Minister Morrison and his team to get to the point where they could make a transition, which was going to have some controversy inside of their country for sure, but making clear to the Australian people, communicating clearly to the Australian people that this made sense for them. As for the United States, to your question, Miles, we have been working to develop for the last handful of years a theory that makes clear that this is not about a particular place, but about security for the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific in particular, and the region in which Australia sits. The part of that region in which Australia sits is central to that security, central for commercial goods to flow through, military security for countries all through Southeast Asia and Pacific Islands. And the agreement that was reached here goes far beyond a couple of submarines and a single set of technologies. There are three important points for the United States. First, we've always known that we are going to need partners. The Trump administration came to believe that the central organizational pillars post-World War II were failing at that. They weren't delivering. And so what you see in AUKUS is a new organization, a new set. In this case, three countries. Watch the Canadians, the Japanese saying we want to be closer to this institution as well. But the historic institutions were failing to deliver security for the United States of America. And so creatively and with a clever twist, we've now delivered a new organization with a mission statement that is very clear, a focus that is sufficiently broad to achieve the end objectives, and with an openness saying, this is what we're trying to do, a transparency, this is what we're trying to do, this is why we are trying to do it, and here's how we intend to achieve it. The submarines get all the focus, but we shouldn't forget the AI activity that's happened just in the last handful of months, where there have been very high-end set of capabilities demonstrated between these three countries, which I always try and measure how effective a test of a technology is by how the potential adversaries respond. And the Chinese responded by saying, this appears to be a waste of taxpayer dollars. And I appreciate the Chinese government worrying about the American taxpayer, very kind of them. We know this, that the relationships that will be built as a result of Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States working together will far exceed the simple and glorious and important benefit of adding a submarine capability to Australia. Two other thoughts, and then I'll close. One is, Boris, one more example of Brexit having a good outcome. This would have been very, very difficult to do inside the constraints of the EU. And then second, the United States also faces a challenge that is highlighted by this opportunity as well. Our industrial base is simply insufficient to deliver against the demands that are being put upon us by the threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses. And so we can certainly talk about this. Prime Minister Morrison, I think, hinted at it. This can't be about subbing out 2 submarines to Australia and 2 fewer or more fewer for the United States of America. We need to invest in the infrastructure here in the United States. The Australians, the British need to invest in infrastructure for their industrial bases as well, because this challenge will continue. Xi Jinping has made very clear his intentions. We need to make sure that we are prepared both from a military and intelligence standpoint, as well as from an economic and industrial-based standpoint, that we're prepared to defend the things that matter to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. So my next question is for Prime Minister Johnson, and the question is, why the United Kingdom? What's the stake for the UK in this deal? And there was some controversy over the previous agreement with Australia and France. What made the United Kingdom a better partner for this strategic agreement?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Miles, and it's a great honor to be part of this panel today, and thanks to the Hudson Institute for what you're doing to put on this discussion. I think it's very, very important, and I believe that AUKUS is a big step forward for Western security cooperation and for the safety and security of the whole world, for reasons I shall explain. Miles, to your point, yes, this was born in a certain amount of diplomatic pain. We have to be honest about that. I congratulate ScoMo, my friend Prime Minister Morrison, on what he did. He was very brave. He looked at a very difficult decision, a very difficult situation, and he knew that the subs deal that they had going with French just wasn't practically going to work for Australia, and that was obvious. It was obvious to everybody, and yeah, a bit of plaster came off the ceiling in the Elysee Palace. There's no doubt about it, and you know there were a few difficult conversations, but I think that realistically, Emmanuel could see the point, and I think he could see the difficulties in the contract. I think that what Mike has said about Brexit is absolutely correct. I don't think it would have been possible for the UK Foreign Office to have done this, or for me to have done this, for a UK Prime Minister to have done this in good faith, if we'd been within the European foreign and security policy as it was previously constituted before Brexit, and it gave us an opportunity. And the key thing about AUKUS is it was driven by naval necessity. It was Tony Radakin on our side and the Australian Navy who first really brought the idea, I think I'm right, ScoMo, to us as politicians and said this is what needs to happen, or this is what could happen. And then it was we, Scott Morrison, Joe Biden and me, who then met to do the deal. And it was the right thing to do, overwhelmingly the right thing to do. And yes, it was unfortunate that France couldn't be involved at that stage, and we had to do it in that way in Carbis Bay in Cornwall, in a way that you know, Emmanuel didn't know about at the time. But ultimately, you know, France is a great Pacific player too. We're going to need French involvement and commitment in that area as much as UK involvement and commitment. And I'm sure there will be a very big role for France to play. But what AUKUS has done has opened up cooperation between these three great English-speaking countries, in not just in nuclear submarine technology, but as Mike has said and as ScoMo has said, in other fields as well. And this is not meant to be, I've said before, this is not meant to be adversarial towards China or indeed anybody. It's meant to be promoting security and stability across the world. And with AUKUS, you have an agreement that truly spans the globe. It's quite extraordinary. And I think if we add on these other things, which we're going to do, not just the manufacture of new submarines, but but AI, quantum, cyber, all the other areas of defense cooperation, I think this has huge potential for the future. And it represents the Anglosphere in action. And it's a concept that has never really had much hard physical reality, the Anglosphere, until I think the AUKUS idea was born. You're now seeing something that I think can really add to the security and stability of the whole world.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Johnson. And now I'm going to turn to my fellow colleagues at the Hudson and Mr. John Lee and Brian Clark. And John, do you want to go first to take the stage and ask questions?
Thank you, Miles. We know China is worried because it's trying to discredit AUKUS in Southeast Asia and Europe by framing it as a backward-looking and divisive Anglo-Saxon agreement. A question for Prime Minister Morrison and Prime Minister Johnson. How did your Southeast Asian and European colleagues react? I don't mean just the French, but your other European colleagues react. And do you think China's having any success in framing things in this negative Anglo-Saxon light?
I might deal with the sort of ASEAN Indo-Pacific sort of reactions first. They were positive, particularly for some. Philippines, for example, were very supportive. Singapore didn't raise any objections. There were some from Malaysia, but the objections we heard largely sort of reflected some of the things that China was saying at the time. So that wasn't really a surprise and where some of those comments came from. Indonesia expressed some initial concern, but there were some other issues circling at that time which I think contributed to that. But they were overcome through the strength of the relationship and just sitting down and explaining. I mean, one of the things that I think we have to appreciate about where we got to, and Boris will remember it well, I mean, the idea that you could have sort of made a sort of a pre-announcement about this and sort of opened the kimono on this in advance of its announcement, and to think that it would have survived the many interests that would have sought to basically torpedo this is foolhardy. It wouldn't have happened. I had been very clear with President Macron, with Emmanuel, and after I'd been in Carbis Bay with Boris and others, and certainly President Biden, that Australia had formed the view and reached the view that conventionally powered submarines were not going to meet our strategic interests, that the strategic situation had changed so dramatically from when we went into that contract, and we still had gates to clear in that contract, that this wasn't going to serve our needs. Now, the next day, the French defence establishment went into overdrive. They called everyone they possibly could who had an Australian accent, and applied some pretty significant pressure. And that was before they had full knowledge of the fact that the contract would be cancelled. Now, at that time, the contract hadn't been cancelled. AUKUS at that time had not yet fully landed. I'd say we're about 80 to 90% of the way there, but there were still issues to be addressed. President Biden still had some matters that he wanted to be comfortable with, and I think Boris, you and I didn't have any issue at all with him running those to ground. I think that only ensured that when this thing took off, that everybody was very comfortable with. So we worked hard on ASEAN. Remember, Australia at that time was the only country, the first country, I should say, to have entered a comprehensive strategic partnership with ASEAN. That was even before China. We'd had a dialogue with ASEAN, which the UK now also have. I think it's the only country in that sphere that has such a dialogue with ASEAN. So we'd put a lot of work in, John, I think, as you know, into all of those relationships. And so when things like this come along, you can sit down, you can talk about it, you can explain it, you can calm people, you can point out what is just a predictable reaction from China and how they'd seek to discredit it. But frankly, they weren't the only ones doing that at the time post-announcement. The French were pretty busy too. But it only proved my point that had they been given the opportunity, I think we would have seen an armada of French diplomats descending, going across the Atlantic to see this ended. So it was the right call to make to do it in the way we did it. Yes, it meant there'd be a little bit of paint lost on the way through, but the idea of giving that up for the sake of not having some sensibilities impacted, I think would have just been irresponsible. And so we're able to land it and then work it through with our partners, and particularly the Quad partners. And Secretary Pompeo might work closely with all the Quad countries, particularly as foreign ministers, and you were part of the first foreign ministers Quad dialogue meetings. India and Japan were very, very supportive of this. They could see what it meant in the region, and all of this adds up to one thing: credible deterrent. And without a credible deterrent in the Indo-Pacific, there can be no peace and stability.
I totally agree with what Scott has just said, and I would just say that I think that it's certainly true, John, to your point about the effectiveness of the Chinese campaign against AUKUS, that they certainly picked up some early support. I remember actually, I think for some reason in a UN meeting the day after some big AUKUS story broke. I think it was the news of the deal itself, and it was a discussion of climate change actually in the Security Council with lots of other players there, and I was amused by how many people in their interventions from sub-Saharan African countries or Caribbean states or Latin American countries or anywhere where China has built up debts, basically crowbarred in to their discussion of climate change, a reference to nuclear submarines, which suddenly became popular. And they said, why are you spending money on nuclear submarines when you should be tackling climate change or giving us money to tackle climate change? I mean, each and every one of them said this as though that they were reading a script from Beijing. And I was very struck by that and thought that clearly a big operation was underway. But when you look at the response in the Pacific region itself, and you look at, I agree totally with what Scott has just said about ASEAN, but I've spoken directly to the three great democracies on the Pacific Rim, as it were, apart from so India, Korea, Japan, and there I think you've got to say that there is the view is very positive, and in each of those cases, what's interesting is that whether it's President Yoon of Korea or Fumio Kishida in Japan or even Narendra Modi in India, they all now want to do technology sharing deals with the UK. They're on marine propulsion, on all sorts of things, and the only limiting factor is really our ability to share some of the technology with some of those partners because of the other relationships that they have and which are well known. But my overall impression is that people are positive, and if anything, what they're looking for, whether through the Quad or through AUKUS, is ways of participating themselves.
Great, Brian, your questions?
Thank you, Miles. Yeah, so we just talked about the international resistance to AUKUS. What about some of the domestic resistance, and how do we overcome that? So on the U.S. side, we're likely to find resistance to selling submarines to Australia that would otherwise be in the U.S. inventory. Even if we try to grow the submarine industrial base, we still won't necessarily get to the point where we can build extra submarines for Australia. And then in Australia, this is going to be a long-term effort requiring a significant investment. And also the concern about how many jobs will actually come to Australia as a result when maybe the ships are being built in the UK. So for Secretary Pompeo and for Prime Minister Morrison, how are we going to overcome that domestic resistance to AUKUS so that we can make the case that these costs are worthwhile and they're necessary in order to maintain deterrence?
Scott, may I go first?
Yeah, please, Mike.
Please.
Thank you. Well, the 3 points, one of which I hit on, but I'll come back to. There's a deep challenge in the American industrial base. It's not just submarines and propulsion systems attached thereto. It goes down to 155 rounds to deliver to Ukraine. So this is a scaled problem. The the AUKUS arrangement simply raises or lowers the river on another rock that I think those of us who've been working at this for a while now have all seen. That, well, it's a little bit about budgeting, it's a little bit about procurement, and it's a little bit about focus, given the 20 years that we spent doing counterterrorism work around the world. So our industrial base shifted dramatically, and we didn't reinvest. And so we must do that. We shouldn't do it for the Australians, we shouldn't do it for the British, we should do it for the Americans. We shouldn't do it for the Ukrainians, we shouldn't do it for the Estonians, we should do it for America. It will have enormous benefits to each of those countries as well as we partner with them in the various places that we all try to continue to work to deter those who want to reshape the world in a way that is fundamentally different than the one that has benefited the American people, and I would argue much of the world, for the last 70 plus years now. And so this industrial-based problem, to your point, becomes a political problem. This week or next, we will see our House of Representatives and the Senate and our president sign a piece of legislation on defense spending, which will be capped for the next 2 years. It is almost certainly going to reduce spending on an inflation-adjusted basis in each of those 2 years. Fair enough. That means there are going to be very hard decisions to make, and it is going to require the chief executive to articulate to the American people why it is we should prioritize their security and spend money on these things that will provide long-term security for them. It is not an easy task. I served in Congress. Much more fun to go home and cut a ribbon on a bridge than to talk to them about an aircraft carrier that will deliver in 9 years. And I'll add this, though, every leader, I always was reminded I'd meet with my counterparts across the world, Prime Minister Morrison or Prime Minister Johnson or the foreign secretaries in each of those nations. They're elected officials in almost every case, unlike me, who was appointed and confirmed. It means they got to go home and make the case. I pray that they will each do that. They will go make arguments in their country about why their long-term security depends on the continued commitment to improve technology and improve set of capabilities. America can't possibly achieve this on its own. It becomes a political battle inside of every country, which means that leaders have to stand up and make the case for why this matters, why this allocation of resource is the right approach. Second thought, it's going to require leaders who make clear that what was done here is enormously good, and we're spending this time appropriately talking about something that is now coming on, a year and a half, approaching 2 years in a few months. The execution of this will matter intensely, because a poorly executed AUKUS agreement will lead to disenchantment in the political space domestically in each of the 3 countries. And so this execution of this is absolutely essential, because while this is necessary, what was done here is absolutely necessary, I can assure you that it is not sufficient. The Chinese Communist Party's intentions will not change as a result of a couple of more nuclear-powered submarines in the Pacific. It is going to take strength over time, reinvestment over time, and a focus and a prioritization that AUKUS actually demonstrates a functional set of relationships to deliver increased security. But we've got to make sure that we pat ourselves on the back sufficiently, fair enough, but tomorrow's another day. And the Chinese Communist Party's response to this indicates they're in this for the long haul. That will require us to do the same, and political leaders inside of their own countries to make the case for why this matters.
Correct.
Mr. Morrison?
Brian, I think all those points by Secretary Pompeo, Mike, are very well made. From the Australian point of view, Australians get it when we did this, and it was very strongly supported. We were living with the sharp end of the grey zone tactics which were being applied to us by China, the Chinese government, then and still now, by the way. And that was all designed to pick one of the US's key allies in the region and seek to roll them. And it was incredibly important for us to resist that coercion. And I'll never forget, Boris, you giving me that platform at the G7 at Carbis Bay when I was able to raise all of these issues with the other G7 leaders and the others who came, Narendra over the phone, but of course President Moon and others who joined us for that sort of D10 type event. where I could share with them just what this meant and what the Chinese government were doing. And that if Australia did not say no and stand up, and we could not have done that without the strong support of the United States and the UK, then that would have basically become the MO for the Chinese government right around the region. So there was an enormous amount at stake, and Australians understood that. And so they were prepared to support it and support it strongly. And I think that's what led what was the opposition then and now the government to also commit to it at the same time. And that sort of locked in an initial bipartisanship, which I think was very important in the Australian domestic context. But Mike's right, the challenges are greater going forward as the dollars start to mount up. Now, when we took the decision, my government were under no illusions about the fact that, particularly Pillar 2, and when you realise Pillar 2, which wasn't about submarines at all, this was all the other things we talked about, AI and quantum and hypersonics and so on. This would mean that our commitment as a share of GDP will have to rise, in my view, it's still my view, to 2.5%. Now that's significant, but that will be necessary to realise the opportunity of AUKUS, which is to ensure that we get access to, but in partnership with the United States and the UK, the most advanced defence technology of anywhere in the world. And that's what collectively we're trying to achieve. Australia also has to be very mindful of the domestic circumstances that both the US and the UK confronted around this, where the argument was not as obvious as it was in Australia. And Boris and I had plenty of chats about that, about the impact this would have positively for the UK. And I'm pleased where it has landed. It has landed post the 18-month period in the space I hoped it would. It had always been our intention that the submarine built, from our perspective, and I know from Boris's, the working prototype idea was the AUKUS submarine that was an extension of the SSNRs in the UK. But the ability to bring in the Virginias, which was also under consideration, and the fact that you could do both, I'm thrilled about it. But it meant being able to be able to understanding of and address our attention to the domestic considerations in the UK. In the United States, it was incredibly important also, while there was tremendous support for it right across the aisle in the Congress and the Senate, but I made it a very early priority. And Boris and I were both in the US, Washington at the time. I met with anyone I could on the Hill. We addressed every committee. There was a joint meeting of both the House majority and minority leadership, right down to the whips. And we took this thing from one end to the other. And we wanted to send a very strong message to the Congress. We get that this is a deal not just with the executive government, but with the Congress as well. Because the things to make it work will require domestic support in both the UK and the US from their parliaments. That means the reform of ITAR. It means the reform of export controls. It means how you actually create a genuine ecosystem between Australia, the United States and the United Kingdom, which means free movement of people, ideas, technology, goods, service, all of these things. That's what will realise the AUKUS opportunity. And Mike and Boris are absolutely right to know that in their own countries, that's not easy. But I think it's very achievable. And to achieve it, you've got to keep the bipartisanship. And I think we are achieving that. We've got our own AUKUS caucus. It's not a raucous AUKUS caucus, as you once used the phrase, Boris. But Mike Gallagher is leading one over there in the United States. He's doing a terrific job there. And I haven't yet sort of connected what the UK version of that is, Boris, but I certainly hope it's there, because you've got to maintain the bipartisanship within the legislatures. Yeah, no, there's no raucous. There's a raucous caucus from the anti-AUKUS caucus, but that was mainly from Beijing and Paris, as we discussed already. Look, I mean, can I just add? I know, Brian, just to add some on your point about procurement and the pressure on US production. Clearly, one solution is to move as fast as possible to production in Perth and indeed in Barrow in Furness, which is part of the original concept, and something that I think is warmly welcomed in my country. And just on the bipartisanship, I remember going in to give the statement on AUKUS the day we announced it, and the leader of the opposition, the Labour leader of the opposition,
interrupt me, just grabbing me on the way and saying, look, I got to admit, I can't find anything to object to in this at all, which was good from them, because he's got about 8 members in his shadow front bench who are actually against nuclear weapons, and in a very different place. But so I think that they will be, it's got big bipartisan support in the UK, and provided we get on and start building it together, I think it's going to continue to carry massive public support here as well.
All right. So I actually have a question. So earlier, Secretary Pompeo, you mentioned about the old alliance not working sufficiently, and obviously, AUKUS is a new beginning, and there are, however, several existing groupings of some sort to face the common challenge and common threat from China. So we all realize there are common threat, and common threat demands common defense. You have the Quad in Asia Pacific. You have existing bilateral defense agreements between US, Japan, and between US and South Korea, and of course between US and the Philippines. How do you see the potential of AUKUS working with those groupings, such as Quad, such as those bilateral relations in Asia Pacific, to form something that's much larger than just the technical and intelligence aspect of AUKUS?
Miles, I think we're already seeing that in many regards. So each of these, if you go back to their founding ideas, their charter, the work that they do, they have different spaces in which they operate. They have a couple of pieces of real commonality. One is a security architecture and framework. The other is a set of economic relationships that lay behind that as well. I think in each of the cases you identified, these are democracies. They share an understanding of how it is you treat your fellow human beings. But we will, as part of this security architecture, draw on an even broader set. Think of our friends in other countries in Southeast Asia that don't operate in democracies in the same way that we all do. We need them to be part of this as well. And I think each of these, because I'll start in a different place. The legacy understandings. Think of the United Nations now having 2 Security Council members that have conducted military conflict against peaceful nations in just the last decade, and are now supporting an armed conflict in Europe. These show a brokenness of the historic institutions, and so it requires a rethinking. That is, how are we going to deliver against this? It doesn't necessarily mean an abandonment. It doesn't necessarily mean walking away, but we have to just be honest. When those historic institutions aren't delivering, right? When the World Health Organization during the pandemic says China's doing a good job, right? That's an institutional, that's not a personal failure of any human being. That is an institutional structural failure to recognize that the mission focus, the stated purpose of those institutions is no longer being delivered against. When the UN Human Rights Organization has Iran as its leader, right? Those are broken. And so one of the important things that we tried to do in the Quad, and we now AUKUS is doing, and you highlighted the historic agreements between the United States, Japan, Philippines, and South Korea. We need to make sure that they are consistent with the challenge that we confront today. And that is as a philosophical matter, that it's not much different, but as a practical, on the ground, in your face threat to the things that have lifted several billion people out of poverty over the last 40 years. That threat remains consistent, and it is going to take new infrastructure. So I'm very hopeful that the Quad and those relationships will only deepen. The 4 of them account for a significant piece of global GDP. I hope AUKUS will continue to deepen and expand, and others will say, I want to be part of that as well. I think it was Prime Minister Johnson who highlighted again, and we always need to come back to this. You shout nuclear and submarine in the same sentence, and everybody goes to the ramparts. These are nuclear-powered, highly safe technologies, and it's just about how you get around and escape detection from an adversary who wants to know where your young men and women are. underwater. We have to make sure that we speak with a single clarion voice that understands the threats that face us today, is prepared to confront them. And when we do that, I'm convinced we can deter these adversaries. And each of these organizations has to be fit for purpose in modern times to actually deliver on that security imperative.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. John, Brian?
Terry's assessment that I share, actually, that Xi Jinping's preparing China for war in a matter of years. And so this decade is the critical decade to deter China. Now, if that's true, do we need to be putting more or disproportionately more effort and resources into the AUKUS Pillar 2 program, which deals with developing strike and denial weapons within the next few years? Because, of course, the submarines for Australia don't come on board until the next 10 years or so. Do we need to focus more on the so-called Pillar 2 elements as a matter of urgency? A question really to any or all of our guests.
I might kick off, John. Well, the short answer is yes. I mean, the Pillar 1 this began in early 2020. I mean, the initiation of AUKUS, which is initially about submarines, that began when our government, I instructed our Defence Department to start having quiet conversations with our partners to actually determine the feasibility of even progressing with this. And so that now has been running for several years to get to the point we're at now. So that's had a bit of a lead time. And that project is now at San Diego, being now confirmed. The 18-month process is finished. They've set their sails and off they go. And in each of our countries, there are significant institutions that have now been set up to go and drive that program. So get on with it is the message to all them. And I know in the States, there's about 100 people working in the Navy now on that program. We've got Australian sailors on others, British and American boats, and the recruitment's already begun. So that is a program where all the prelim work, at least for the start-up and launch phase of getting this project moving, has been done. But that is a long lag on it for the ultimate delivery of the capability. The decision to include the Virginias and bring them on early, I think, was a very positive one and supported strongly, and also was, within the guidelines and the expectations of what could be achieved when we set out about this. But Pillar 2 brings more near-term capabilities into effect. Pillar 2 brings in a credible deterrent more here and now. And it's also the sphere in which the technology is moving most rapidly. It's an area in which I think between the three nations we can strike distance and hold distance by continuing the technological development. We have the capability, and this goes to then how we work with partners. Now, personally, I think AUKUS, we've got to be very jealous of it. It is a highest common denominator partnership. You get into this by bringing something to the table. There's no doubt countries like Japan can absolutely do that and sit completely within the like-mindedness of the partnership. But they've still got a bit of a journey to travel on, and I can foresee projects with which AUKUS will work with Japan. I would say they'd be the first cab off the rank, and even potentially quite soon on a project-by-project basis. But then there's the broader dialogue partners AUKUS can have. Now, what Boris did in Carbis Bay, I thought was brilliant, a sort of a G7 plus initiative. And I know that had been the intention of the Trump administration to do something very similar, Mike, but unfortunately the meeting couldn't go ahead because of COVID. But there was a very similar idea, and we'd been invited to come to that as well as at others. So this idea of having an AUKUS plus dialogue, indeed a Quad plus dialogue with others who have a very big focus on the Indo-Pacific or who can bring things to the table, but you can't turn AUKUS into a sort of a like-minded coffee club for minilateral, expression. It can't be that. This has to stay top shelf all the way. And if you can bring something to the table, well, there's a discussion to have. But it's not, I want to be involved. Can I please?
Yeah. Can I just add something, Scott? Because I totally agree with that. And we're at a pivotal point now in the early 21st century, right? The war in Ukraine is one of those things that has got the whole global audience looking and wondering which side they should be on. And very clearly you've got Russia, China, I don't know, North Korea or whoever on one side, and broadly speaking, you've got Europeans, NATO. I mean, with some interesting exceptions, but Europeans, NATO, Australia, and Japan, strongly backing Korea, strongly backing the Ukrainians. So you've got a kind of most of the D10, get lined up against Russia, China over Ukraine. But in the middle, there is a great mass of swing voters. And I mentioned them earlier, the countries in Latin America, in Africa, that are going to go one way or the other. Now, that's why backing the Ukrainians is so crucial, because the one thing those countries will respond to, and the one thing that will make a difference to the way they understand what's going on, is military victory by the Ukrainians and the vindication of Western support. And that is the thing that will really persuade them and interest them. And I think AUKUS is another demonstration of Western resolve, our willingness to do difficult things, to express strength, to express our commitment to each other around the world. And that's why I think it's very, very important that we do exactly as Scott says. This should be a very ambitious, a very, very practical cooperation agreement between countries that really have something to offer and wish to work together on defense and security. Now, I just want to make a point about India, because I think that this is the most fascinating of all the swing voters. India, in the D10, Narendra with us in Carbis Bay, but the fascinating thing is that India is in a different space on Ukraine. And all I would say is I think there's a job of work to be done by friends of India to say, look what's happened to Russian military equipment in Ukraine. It's been a fiasco. You couldn't have had a worse advertisement for Russian military capabilities than what's happened in Ukraine. I think that their missiles are less accurate than my first serve in tennis, which is saying something. We've got to be saying to the Indians who are so important in the Pacific. Look, why do you have this the incubus of your historic military relationship with Russia? What is this all about? And I would just suggest this is an important campaign now. It's been that since the 50s. The Indian-Russian thing, I think it's starting to run out of road. We need to find ways of convincing our Indian friends that they need to move across into our side of the conversation. And the more it's a difficult thing to do, but I think it's really, really worthwhile, because at the moment, India, for defense purposes, but certainly for defense procurement, is very plugged in to the wrong side.
Brian, you have a question?
Yes, thanks, Miles. So building on that, in AUKUS Pillar 1, we're going to bring US and UK submarines on regular deployments to Australia. Under Pillar 2, should we be looking to bring high-end capabilities from the US and UK to Australia on a regular basis, B-21 bombers, hypersonic boost glide weapons, et cetera? So not just technology development, but also improving the military posture in Australia. And does that make Australia essentially a sandbox for demonstrating the Allied capability against China? And that for any of our guests to answer. Thank you.
Mike, did you want to go for that one first?
Sure. Look, this will this will prove complicated, politically difficult, and it is necessary. But we shouldn't focus just on Australia. We collectively need to do this throughout the region. We should be doing it with our friends in the Philippines. We should be doing this with our friends in Japan. We should be doing this with our friends in South Korea. We should continue to do training for the people of Taiwan, who will need to defend themselves against what is inevitably Xi Jinping's intention, his stated intention. And Australia is certainly amongst them. And AUKUS gives us a great platform to begin to think about how to do that properly. But joint training exercise is something we worked on with the Australians during the Trump administration. Good stuff throughout the region, not just in the local waters in Australia, but all across the region. These are things we all collectively need to do. And 3 great militaries, highly capable, of each not only reinforcing our capabilities jointly amongst the 3 of ours, but helping train the forces of the other nations in the region as well. Each of us should be looking not only to be better between and amongst ourselves, but helping the other security apparatuses throughout the region become better alongside of us as well.
I would agree with all of that. I think what is done with where things are deployed and how you might do that, well, it'll be sensitive in some cases, but it really has to be driven by the needs of the project. What I think is actually more important is the mobility of the people that are involved in all of this, moving between the UK, the United States and Australia, and ensuring there is that can be achieved. I mean, what effectively this has to do is, as best as you're able, integrate the industrial bases, the defence industrial bases of Australia, the United States and the UK, and to have them operating almost as seamlessly as you possibly can in one ecosystem. And it's sort of, you've got the spheres of government working together and your defence forces, and you've got your spheres of your industrial bases working together. And then you've got your spheres of groups, whether it's like the Hudson Institute or whoever it might be, think tanks, universities, the scientists, the technologists that are out there sort of charting the narrative in the longer term view about what this is. And all 3 of them those spheres have to come together. Now, that's quite a bit to juggle. But that's what makes AUKUS work. So I would say it's more in pillar 1 about really being able to knock down the barriers, which enables the free movement of people, capital, ideas, technology, and the integration of all of that as much as is humanly possible and technologically possible, because that's what will produce the outcome. Remember, the outcome is to have the most advanced defence technology in the world, because that is what is going to make others who would be adversaries sit up and take notice and think twice and redo their calculus about what their intentions might be. I mean, John's right. They are planning and preparing to be able to do something. That doesn't mean they will. I'm not one of those ones who think that's as imminent. And I think one of the reasons it's not as imminent is because of the work that has been done on credible deterrent, of which AUKUS and Quad have been such an important part. And what really undermines that credible deterrent is when you get some leaders going on saying, well, we're a long way away from the Taiwan Strait, so maybe it's not in our interests. That is the sort of thing that invites a sort of Aitchison line out of Europe for the Indo-Pacific. That sort of thing is very dangerous.
I agree with all that. I think that this is one of those situations where AUKUS is building on what practically happens anyway. Part of people's lived experience. If I'm a UK politician in a meeting on defence, or if I'm visiting a naval base or whatever, and a military base, and I meet some people speaking with an Australian accent, or I meet some people speaking with an American accent, I'm not remotely surprised. And there is already a huge amount of cooperation and exchange. And I think what AUKUS is doing is simply building on that, and it needs to be taken as far as we can possibly go.
Well, with that, I'd like to make some concluding remarks. And I remember former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher said, in order to change the nation to the right direction, and you must win the argument first, and then make policy and take action. the argument was that China is a central threat. I remember when Secretary Pompeo first uttered that statement in London, as a matter of fact, that the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party is a central threat of our time. And when he said that, there are a lot of skeptics. But now that argument was won, and we have convinced the world. As after all, China has convinced the world that the Chinese Communist Party is a central threat of our time. So now comes to action and come to policy stand. And I believe AUKUS, as we demonstrate here today, is the very important step to take a concrete, practical, and a real step to face that challenge. And when I was working at the Secretary Pompeo's office under his guidance, and I had the opportunity to meet with some of the diplomats from all across the place. And many of them had sent me the message that you should not force us to take side between the United States and China, as if all the world's problem is between the United States and China. So, and then after a while, I began to realize the reason they're hedging is not because really the Hudson choice between China and the United States is really believe they do not enough confidence to believe that the United States is not hedging. They don't think that we are serious. They don't think the United States is committed to seriously to secure global peace and prosperity. And I believe AUKUS is a very important statement to assure our friends and allies that the United States and its friends and allies, particularly Australia and the UK, are not hedging. We take this threat very seriously. And for that, and I thank all the brilliant and insightful comments from the most authoritative sources on AUKUS here today, and Secretary Pompeo and Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Prime Minister Johnson, and my fellow colleagues from Hudson Institute, John Lee and Brian Clark. Thank you very much, and have a good day.